Thanks everyone for coming today and giving up your lunchtime to come and take part in something. So hopefully this will be exciting. I appreciate it's kind of difficult to eat and do activities, but we'll have a bit of a talk for the first part, and then we'll be doing a kind of small mini workshop that will be quite fast. So don't see this as the extent of what you could be doing. You could use this method in a lot more depth. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be using a method called new metaphors and applying it in a kind of design thinking way to generate ideas for new opportunities for business or startups, or even just ways of reframing existing ways you could do things that might be interesting opportunities to pursue. And it doesn't have to be in a commercial sense. They could be ideas for rethinking things in your own lives, or they could be ways of reframing things for nonprofits or other ways. This is essentially, I'm kind of leaving it up to you to make connections in some way to how you might be able to apply these ideas or use them. And hopefully you'll be able to, or you'll be able to see that they have some value. So let's just think about this for a minute, right? So this is it's a river. It's flowing quite slowly. There's some droplets and so on. You might think that maybe new ideas are a bit like this in some way. Some of them are dropped into the kind of pool of, I don't know, the market maybe. Maybe this is a metaphor for the market. Occasionally something drops that has a big impact that affects other things, and it causes other ripples and so on, and they intersect with each other, and then it kind of dies away again, and then something else happens and it causes it. This could be a metaphor in some way for thinking about how new ideas enter the world and the effects they have. Many of them have very limited effects. Some of them have bigger effects. You might think, well, that's a weak metaphor. There's lots of reasons that doesn't work. And that's sort of the point of what we're going to be doing today, is looking at how, in some ways, almost anything can be a useful metaphor for other things, and the extent to which you use that as an idea and say, okay, these things are structurally similar in some ways and not in others, can be a way of generating new ideas or new ways of thinking about problems or reframing them or generating directions that you hadn't thought of before. So you could say maybe, droplets and ripples and so on are a metaphor for new business ideas or new ideas in general. Or you could say, well, maybe conversation is a better metaphor for how ideas spread and markets develop around particular ideas, perhaps. Maybe it is about, people using a service or not, they're effectively having a conversation with that service, perhaps. And in some cases they're ignoring it, in some cases they're listening, and others they're arguing. Again, there's no right approach, but there's features that might be interesting to consider. Maybe mosaics and tiles are an interesting metaphor for types of business. They fit together in particular ways. Some of them are about filling in the cracks where other shapes have left gaps or left opportunities for someone else to fill something in. They get replaced, I guess, over time. They build up to a picture that is not necessarily individually planned, in this case, by one person, but it's the result of lots of different actors, each creating their own thing to occupy a particular niche, if you like, and they fit together to produce a kind of overall picture. I hope you see where I'm going with this, is that almost everything in some way can be an interesting metaphor for something else if you pay attention to the features that you find useful or generative or interesting for you. Some people would think about it in this way, maybe the progression of new ideas, the progression of new businesses, innovations and so on, they often grow on the shoulders of others, or in some cases on the detritus created by others. The fact that this, how these plants can grow on this wall is due to some extent the dirt, the soil that's produced by, initially maybe the wind blowing things on there or weathering the rock, leaving a layer that then other things can grow in. And then once that starts to grow, other things can grow on the detritus from that, or the results of that first layer growing. And in some ways, lots of new ideas and businesses are kind of like that. They're growing on the remnants of previous ideas, or what didn't go well with one idea can be the starting point for another. Maybe it's like this. Maybe it's an overgrown greenhouse where things are struggling to reach some sort of source of energy or source of light or funding or attention. And some of them shade out others. Some of them grow very well. Maybe some of them overgrow and actually end up shading out themselves, or end up then, leading to a kind of, a collapse. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. These are just ways that, if you start to think about what you're doing in terms of some other approaches, sometimes it can lead to you, either having something very profound as a revelation about your own approach, or it can be that it just suggests maybe this is how our competitors are thinking, maybe this is how someone else is thinking without even necessarily articulating it. So we'll come back to these in a minute, these sorts of ideas. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit first about what we do. The Imaginaries Lab is a relatively new, well, it's not really a venture, I suppose. It's a relatively new unit at Carnegie Mellon, based in the School of Design, and so we started this in 2017. And it's a group of us who are using design research methods, the sort of methods that designers might use, to address other issues, I guess, to apply them to problems beyond just how do we design things, but perhaps applying to things in the world more generally. So there's a team of us, 6 master students. We have here Steph and Michelle, who are going to be helping today with the exercise, and me and a few undergrads working on different things as well. But what we're based around, so the idea of imaginaries is not just about imagination, which would be nice, but it's a little bit, I guess, overdone as a concept. The idea of imaginaries is a concept from sociology, really, that looks at almost society-level mental models of things. Like what happens when, you individually might have a particular understanding of something or a mental model of, I don't know, how the internet works or, how climate change works. But at a societal level, what happens when those kind of individual understandings become something that actually affects things on a big scale? There's something about societal imaginaries of climate change and the different imaginaries of that affects government policy, for example, in different countries very differently. So is it worth studying that? Well, sociologists study that, but we were looking at it almost as, well, can designers study that? Or can the methods that designers might use to develop new products or services, can we use some of those methods as a way of investigating how people understand things, how they think about concepts, and what we could do differently with that? So the idea of imaginaries is sort of based around this from a 1920s psychology textbook. I mean, the idea has been expressed in lots of different ways, but it's basically if people define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. And you might disagree with that. You might say, well, that's not, or you might say, well, in some circumstances it's true, in others not. But if you took that as true and said, well, whether or not how people are explaining something is actually how the world is, if they act as if that's true, that the consequences are perhaps the same or very similar to whether if it were true. So we sort of take that as a starting point as something that's worth investigating, I guess. So we look at things like stories people tell, the fictions people might create, and we see, can we use design methods to kind of investigate them, but also to create new ones. So some of the subjects we are investigating are things like metaphors we will see today, but also people's mental models, mental imagery, the heuristics people might follow, like the kind of rules that they maybe follow for themselves, even if they don't express it formally. Things like folk theories, if any of you know these kind of concepts. So really what we're doing is using design methods to understand how people understand, and helping people understand in new ways, and help people imagine new ways of living, which is sort of a sequence of, I guess, meeting people where they are, understanding how they're thinking about things at present, and then trying to help them understand in new ways or see what we can do to, what opportunities there are for doing that. So some of the sorts of projects we've done over the last couple of years have been things like using model landscapes to help people explore their own lives or how they think about their own career paths. So building landscapes as groups that involve kind of charting different paths, discussing them, not because there's a right answer, but because it's a way of enabling people as a group to communicate about how they're thinking and sharing things that may be difficult to express otherwise. We've applied this to various different topics. It's not always about people's own lives. So next month, we're going to be doing something using this about how different disciplines think about each other, for example. So, how do people, like within Carnegie Mellon, you probably think of, the people in that building over there, you perhaps lump them together as a single unit. But for the people in that building, they may see themselves as being many different departments, many different disciplines intersecting in different ways. They probably look over at Tepper and think, oh, all of that's the same. That's a unit, perhaps. So there are ways of how you can use these kind of methods to explore how people are actually thinking about systems they're in, and how that kind of view of each other can affect how you actually act. And obviously there's no wrong answer with it, because it's, you could draw an org chart, but this is a different way of investigating it, I guess. We've done quite a lot of work on enabling people to kind of materialize their own experiences of mental health as well, using these sorts of methods, where again, there's no wrong answer, there's no right answer. But if you, like the one on the left there, that was someone expressing their feeling of dread. They saw themselves, at least from explaining it, as that small white hard ball in the center that's kind of surrounded by these looming, taller, black, kind of overshadowing things. So they're trying to get towards the bits on the outside that were kind of a way through this. It's a sort of form of art therapy, perhaps, but it can enable discussion between people of abstract concepts that otherwise are perhaps difficult to visualize or say in words. I've done some work in the past on things like how do people imagine energy, because there's loads of work on reducing energy use and businesses centered on new types of display and feedback methods. But actually, there hasn't been much work done on how do people visualize this abstract thing that they're told to use less of. Do you visualize it in terms of numbers? Well, not that many people do. I mean, some people do, but even the numbers are not necessarily correlated with actually what's going on. So this was some work looking at actually people's mental imagery around this kind of abstract concept and how you might then apply it to the design of new kinds of products and things. I might skip over this because of just for time, but I mean, we've been looking at various ways of developing new types of interfaces that are based more around qualities in the world rather than necessarily quantifying things. And one of these was a kind of ambient sonification of energy use in Margaret Morrison over there, where we were turning the electricity use of the building not only into sound, like ambient sound, rather than having a display, but also vibrations that were then reflected onto the wall. So you end up with a very different kind of way of seeing and hearing how much energy is being used by the building. It got annoying after a while, as I'm sure you. Anyway, but to get onto metaphors and what we're going to do today in the exercise, it's really about carrying across. So metaphors are really about the idea of carrying one idea across from one place to another. And maybe a bridge is a good metaphor for a metaphor. I don't know. I mean, we could think about that. I mean, a bridge is planned, it's constructed, it's about leading people from one place to another. But then it's, requires quite a lot of thought and planning and investment. Maybe a ferry is a better metaphor because it can be directed in different directions, and people can perhaps join it at different places. It could go on a different route. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. These are examples of how you could use one thing to explain another. Even things like this at the airport, this is very much planned. This is saying you need to get from here to here. We want to carry your thinking perhaps from here to here without any divergence, without any choice. I don't know, they're metaphors for metaphors. Maybe that's too much to think about. But you can look at it in this way, that in some way maybe metaphors are about seeing connections between things. So it's a form of pattern recognition perhaps. And when you start to think about it in those terms, it becomes something that maybe is allied with approaches to how people innovate, how people come up with new ideas, creativity research in this form, where it's almost about spotting connections between the structure of problems or the structure of concepts that can then be, can then actually enable new ideas to be generated from it. Or it could be that it's about noticing patterns at a bigger scale or smaller scale. There's a quote from Mary Catherine Bateson, who was, she's an anthropologist, who said that, perhaps it's the same kind of pattern recognition in a way that's about seeing the spirals of growth in seashells as being kind of analogous to the form of cyclones or the form of galaxies. Like that form of multi-scale pattern recognition is often a kind of metaphorical approach. But it's important to remember with all of these that, a metaphor is not the thing itself. It's a model, right? It's a map rather than being a territory. And I'm sure some of you know the quote, the George Box quote, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. All metaphors are wrong by definition. They have to be wrong. They're not the actual thing, but some of them could be useful sometimes. And so that's sort of the level of what we're pitching here, I guess. So why would you want new metaphors? Like, what would be the value of generating new ones? Well, it may be that current metaphors are psychologically harmful in some way. Right? It might actually be that, talking about cancer as something people fight and are defeated by or defeat themselves, are able to defeat themselves actually limits, maybe psychologically harmful to people, might almost limit the discourse that arises around it. It's seen as very much a kind of antagonistic thing, whereas that may not actually be people's experience, and it may not help the way people are engage with it. There's certainly a lot of debate and a lot of work around political metaphors and how, how getting certain metaphors into for example, into the media, so they become the default way of thinking about something or talking about a concept, can lead to a lot of, a lot of potential consequences. We see quite a lot around things like big data, or data in general. So much talks about it as equivalent to something like oil or fuel that can be consumed. It's to be extracted, like the value is to be extracted from people, and and used in other ways. Are there other metaphors for data that actually might enable different kinds of approach or different ways of thinking about it? There's been a lot of work on metaphors for economies, and how framings of economies as being something like a bucket or a container where some people are putting money in and others are taking money out, but it's effectively a zero-sum kind of thing. That can lead to, that leads to particularly media using household metaphors for entire national budgets. So, if it was at household level, well, our incomings mustn't, need to be greater than our outgoings or equal, and so on. But actually, that leads potentially to austerity policies. It leads to a particular framing of economies at a national level that maybe don't actually match the realities of what governments can do. So, but perhaps for this workshop, the most interesting bit is this. So how new metaphors could lead to creativity, idea generation within teams. So it's effectively about framing problems in different ways. And it's a form of kind of idea generation through juxtaposition, right, which is probably familiar to some of you from if you've done any kind of, kind of structured creativity work. It's quite common, effectively, just to say, like, how are these two things related? How could they be related? Effectively, almost picking them at random or noticing things in the world that could be related. And there's been lots of work on this in kind of, studies of creativity and innovation, different forms of this kind of juxtaposition of concepts. So what we're hopefully going to try and do today, and it will only be quite a short exercise just because of time, but we're going to try and generate some new metaphors to inspire or suggest new products or services or ways of rethinking things that already exist. And I mean, we've done, we've done some methods before. We've created some things that effectively just mash them up randomly. Twitter bots, and Devika Singh, who graduated earlier this year, created like an SMS chatbot where you could ask it, could you give me a new metaphor for something? And it would just effectively randomly select things and say, well, this could be it. And occasionally they were really profound. Occasionally it was like, yeah, actually, this could be a new way of thinking about this. But what it is really, and what we're going to do with the cards you have on the table, is effectively pairing concepts that are important but are maybe hard to visualize or hard to engage with, but we know they exist, with images of phenomena in the world that could potentially work as a metaphor for the concept. So, I don't know, so these could a windsock, or how could a windsock be a metaphor for confidence? Like, I mean, any ideas on this? Like, it doesn't have to be, profound. It could just be, well, like, are they similar? Is there anything you could imagine that could work? Yeah.
When there's more energy, when there's more wind blowing, you can demonstrate the
right.
confidence of the wind's not going out.
Yeah.
Horizontal.
Right, so that could be, so really direct, kind of almost seeing the wind as being equivalent to confidence that's in the air somehow. Yeah, that makes sense. Any other? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so it's actually related to the wind itself. Then in that case, it's a kind of like, you need this thing, and this illustrates that it's there. It can give you confidence. Any other thoughts on this? Yeah.
I think when we keep in mind, it tends to blow things away and kind of be the force of energy, but when something kind of utilizing that energy to your own purpose.
Makes sense. Okay, so you're using the energy for something for your purpose rather than. Nice. That makes sense. Yeah. So some other people sorry, go on. Yeah. Okay. Well, some other people, when we've done this, we've asked this question, have said things like, well, maybe confidence is actually all around us, perhaps, but a way of picking it up. So you know how sometimes if you're somewhere where something suddenly makes you feel more confident, or something gives you confidence, you then realize that actually it was there all the time, but it was kind of hidden perhaps, or you weren't realizing that you had it. So in some ways, like seeing the fact that the windsock gives you enables you to see the fact that the wind is in a certain direction. And if only you could pick it up, if only you could grab it, it could give you confidence. Maybe the windsock itself represents, the changing kind of fields of confidence around you. Perhaps it, as it declines, it's almost saying that confidence is ebbing away in some way. There's loads of different ways you can think about it. there's no right or wrong, but this is just randomly selected as a card. So in some ways, it could be something else. Maybe it's erosion is a metaphor for confidence. And there might be the obvious thing there that your confidence is eroded by something that, that kind of takes it away. But the other way around, maybe something eroding, becoming more smooth, becoming more aligned with its environment is actually similar to being, you becoming more comfortable with the situation, perhaps. Maybe the rough edges being not, you becoming more comfortable with the situation, perhaps. Maybe the rough edges being knocked off off this cliff by weathering is almost like you becoming more attuned to the situation you're in and therefore more confident. I don't know, there's no right answer. They're literally randomly selected things. But you can imagine if you were trying to build an app that, supported people in becoming more confident in social settings or in business settings, this might not be a good metaphor for it, but there might be elements from some of these that you could use, and you could say, okay, this is a completely different mechanic. This is not a leaderboard or a graph, but is a different way of engaging people in that concept. There are various structured forms for generating these. So Metaphoria, which is an interesting thing from out of Columbia University, which we use large kind of dictionaries, thesauruses, to suggest metaphors that might work, and then in a textual form. There's obviously, some of you probably know things like this, like Oblique Strategies, that was a kind of card deck from Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt in the 1970s that really is about overcoming kind of creative blocks or points when you're not sure what to do. You pick something random, because any like not making a decision is still a decision in some way. So if you pick a strategy that suggests something, listen to the quiet voice, give way to your worst impulse. They're not all as short as this. Some of them are much longer. A way forward can be worth doing. So we've run lots of workshops using these cards or previous versions of them. This was in this room last year, and we've done loads of them at different industry conferences, particularly kind of user experience design and service design kind of events to generate new ideas. And in general, they have longer than you're going to have, but there's usually something that comes out of it that people say, actually, we're going to be able to use this in our own work. This has enabled some reframing. There's some thought that has got a different way of approaching a situation. Even if they build on it or change it, it gives some kind of initial direction. So your challenge in the next 20 minutes is going to be working groups. So if you're not at a table, I guess join one of the tables. So you might have to face backwards, but it doesn't, well, not face backwards, but you might have to face the people across the table. But it doesn't matter. We're not going to be doing anything else on screen in the next couple of minutes. Look through the cards you have in front of you and try and join them together in ways that you think could inspire a particular an idea that's interesting to you. There are worksheets that you can use to help, and I'll show you in a second what that means. You don't have to use them, but they can be a way of structuring your thinking. So basically, you've got red text cards, which each have a concept on them that perhaps is difficult to visualize or difficult to engage with, but which we know is important in the world. And what I'd like you to try and do is assume that these are like, so this one, which is called Unwritten Rules, assume that this is an insight that's come from some kind of customer research that you've done. So maybe you've been working with small business owners who are trying to work out how to establish, a new business in a city, and they're coming across this problem of there are so many unwritten rules, or they're written in a form that I don't understand or I can't get access to. Right? So assume these are insights that have come from user research. And what we really want you to do is to pair them with something try pairing them with other cards and say, well, could this work? Like, how could adapters work as a metaphor for unwritten rules? Maybe there's something about the adapters as being like a tool that you can offer that enables people to transform from one context to another. So maybe that's like some sort of, kit of maneuvers or moves that a new business can make, or that builds on experience from others or something, or enables adapting to a different market or a different country. Something like that. I just made that up, right? So you've got more time to think that through. But so try out multiple combinations. It's meant to be quite creative. So you could lay the cards out and just see, does something catch your eye? You could do it as a group. You could maybe, each person could pick one that interests them, or maybe as a group you do it together. I've mentioned that. So we're going to assume they're insights that have arisen during customer research. In reality, you would do this properly, just for time. You can use the worksheet if it makes sense. All these are really are listing characteristics that the different things have and seeing which things map very well. So like a previous group doing this, looking at, could reflections be a good metaphor? How could they be a good metaphor for online discussion? Saw that there are particular things that link very well, like there's sort of elements of like, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, and, how reflections match with that, and so on, and seeing some properties that link and some that don't as a way of generating ideas. But you don't have to be that formal with it, but that's one way you can do it. And so ideally, like if you could get to the stage of thinking, could there be some sort of new product or service or something that is at least, inspired by or makes use of some of these juxtapositions. And then for the last kind of 5 minutes or so, we'll talk about some of them. So we probably won't be able to get around every group, but just really briefly, if there are ideas that have come to mind. This is an example of some of the ways people have done things in the past with, this is interesting about power relations in organizations. So like our shadow's a good metaphor. Like there's some people whose shadow seems to, in a good or bad way, kind of be cast over others. Like it's like either you're in that person's shadow or their shadow suddenly looms and it changes how you understand the power structure. So yeah, I will leave that. We'll come back to this maybe at the end if we have time. But does that make sense? So in groups, just look through the cards, try and match them up and see what kind of ideas you could generate. So yeah, go. Right, just everyone, just because of time, so that you can leave at the end at 1:30. It'd be really good to go around each group and just tell us a little bit about what you've been thinking about. Right, and I don't expect you to have come up with a new product at this, in a very short period of time, because then that might not even be the right approach. But if there are ideas that you've come up with, or even if you could tell us through some of the things you've been thinking about and how they led to this idea, that would be, that would be really good. There's no right or wrong. This is really just to see like how's your thinking been going. So I mean, there probably is enough time to talk to each group, which is good. So maybe does one group want to start? Like, is there anyone confident about what they're doing? Do you guys want to start? Yeah, okay, so yeah, maybe stand up or show the room the kind of the cards that you've.
Sure. Yeah. So there's two basically that we kind of drove from. The first, the red card being other people's thoughts or emotions, and the blue card being the wider view. That's kind of the image of the broad mirror. And so what we're kind of thinking about here is that being able to take a wider view of information, being able to see more around yourself, you can take others' thoughts and emotions better into account, and use that to kind of like inform your own opinion, your own decision, and to take action from that. And one of the products that we were thinking about that would go along with something like this would be sort of like a Wikipedia type platform where users can post information around their opinions for like different legislative changes or other sorts of things going on in like the political environment, and you can go there with your own opinion and learn more about how other people are viewing this sort of problem, this potential solution, and try to use that as a way of better informing.
That sounds good. That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, I guess that, yeah, it's strange that doesn't quite exist in that way. Or maybe it does, but it hasn't got enough use that we know about it, I guess. It's really good. Interesting. What do people think? Does it make sense as an idea? I mean, you probably would have come up with it without the cards, but maybe they're a way of supporting, that gives you a phrase that you can use, I guess.
I have a question for you. So
yeah.
we picked the red card, right, as the customer problems.
Yeah.
And then we look through the images and try to find something that matches it.
Yeah.
Would there be value in saying, okay, I'm randomly giving you an image.
Yeah.
Now
Find it.
try
Yes.
to find the parallels. What do you think works better, or either way?
I think people have more fun when they have a bigger set of images to choose from, based on some of the workshops we've run where we've given people a very small set to choose from. They worry too much about, is this the right, am I doing it wrong? So yeah, I mean, obviously a completely forced association thing, we say literally you have to find parallels between, I don't know, the fabric of this chair and the Cold War, right? That, I don't know, I just made it up, but I mean, like that could be that works, but it's not, like it's fun, but it may be, I don't know, there's no wrong. I mean, yeah, I don't know, would you have preferred it if there'd been a smaller set of
No, I don't know. I think
Yeah,
it's just an interesting thought because now you have to think really deeply
Yeah.
about that image. How does it relate?
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I mean, that could be a way of doing it. Yeah, it might be good for. It might be good to have that as a pre-exercise. Like a first thing is like think really deeply about something, learn that method, and then have a bigger expanse of stuff to choose from. Maybe, I don't know. Or the other way around. Yeah.
I was just going to say that's sort of kind of what we did at the beginning with
Yeah.
sock and
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thought that I had on the cards is you're already guiding our thinking
Yeah.
in terms of
Yes. Of course. Yeah.
Whereas, again, you could disregard the sentence or the word
Yeah.
and only look at the image
Yes.
or be biased.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, I mean, part of the goal, I mean, I didn't say it with this, but part of the goal is to, if you had this as a set of cards, you eventually no longer need any of them because initially you discard the red cards. So the red cards come with lots of blank ones for you to put your own concept actually in it. And then you no longer need them because you've got your concept, the thing that you're trying to work on. And then eventually, you can replace these with your own collection of things you take photos of or concepts that matter to you. So it's sort of meant to be something that eventually is no longer needed at all. It's like you gradually phase out each bit of it and replace it with your own stuff, which may make sense. I don't know. I mean, it's just an approach. What was your idea? Or what did you do as a group? Was your
I think, well, we had trust as the big idea.
Right.
It wasn't and we were looking at a couple of different pictures. We had pipes and some transportation related images. We were talking about the commonality between all of them that we were looking at. Really about that transition and change and sending information one place to another. So I talked a little bit about internet information security, right?
Yeah.
Protecting yourself as you're going from point A to point B.
Interesting. It's good. So that could be a like almost seeing that metaphor of that you're protecting while your information's traveling, I guess, or while from.
Both is the promise that,
Yeah.
especially with some of the bridge images that we're using, where it's a fixed path, the promise
Okay.
that you're going a
Yeah.
certain place, and same with the pipe.
Right.
You're going down a specific channel. But again, especially in the pipe case where you're encased completely around, you're protected as you go through that.
Nice. Okay. So that's and you know that your data then secure, not other people can't see it. It's
That can get
yeah,
through,
yeah,
so that
yeah.
helps you.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I thought it was interesting, like something about trust and equity. These are the two on the top of the pile. They have kind of dual meanings.
Yeah.
So it was kind of we went down one path with equity, and then we switched to the other meaning of the word with some of the different pictures. So that was an interesting part. It's more clear cut what when there's a picture.
Yeah.
And it's just a word like you can interpret it like you want to.
Yes. And that was a decision we had to make. Like, I mean, Michelle, I remember us having a discussion about like, should we have words at all on the images, or should they just be images? But I think I don't know. You can read lots of different things into the images, but maybe it's better to have a word that prompts you at least to consider it in one way to start off with. You can always then ignore it and say, well, I'm going to use hummingbirds as the metaphor here rather than sweetness, or I'm going to use like bird feeders as the metaphor rather than sweetness. Like you could do that, right? You don't actually have to use the text that's on it. Okay, that was good. Cool. What about this group? What did you think of?
So the one that stood out for us was splashes of paint and your own sense of agency in the world.
Right.
And this was cool. We started out by looking at the paint and just thinking like, oh, like maybe you're a little red dot and you're kind of competing with some other red dots around you, or maybe there are other colors that really bring out the red and it's like a beautiful contrast, or maybe there are some that are similar that you may gravitate towards, or maybe you're like this long yellow line where you really have a big sense of agency. You're taking up more space because you feel more comfortable or confident or secure. And then we kind of took a step back and we're like, wait, all of these red dots could also make up one person, right? And as you go through life figuring out your sense of agency, maybe different things shine through in different scenarios or different situations where you kind of bring the reds together with the blues and the yellow, and then suddenly you're like a Jackson Pollock piece.
Right. Nice.
So for us, that was like, whoa, like kind of taking a step back and seeing it on a different level.
That's really interesting.
I wouldn't say we came up with a product.
No.
It was insightful.
But it could be a way of thinking about, I don't know, people's profiles on like, I don't know, social media or networking sites, how, like if it were easier to make it up from layers of different identities or different parts of your life rather than it being like, this is a singular presentation of everything. I don't know, or maybe that happens anyway. But like, I don't know, there could be ways of changing that approach, I guess. I don't know, could you have multiple, like a profile for each part of yourself rather than just the whole of you, you know? I don't know, maybe.
Some way of like connecting like different moods or, you know, things that you're feeling
Yeah.
at different points when you posted a picture.
Yeah, right.
You know, wrote a status on Facebook
Yeah.
when you were 15.
Yeah, exactly right. Which, that's really interesting. That's an interesting combination.
I mean, it may think of products or services that help you understand yourself. Business planners are obviously pretty complex.
Yeah,
Don't have anything more specific in mind, but I think I
Yeah.
fell on that similar train of thought.
yeah. It's good. It's cool. Thank you. That's really good. Oh, sorry. And then, okay, finally this group.
Yeah. So we have, they're not gonna lift up.
Okay.
We have, thank you. Being part of an ecosystem is like ice remaining in the shadows.
Interesting.
And the way we ended up thinking about it, which Nobu, I like the way that you put it, is that when you have an ecosystem, you normally think of it being very harmonious and being very uniform. But in reality, there are elements of it that are going to look different from each other.
Yeah.
There's going to be cold parts, light parts, hot parts. And so I was just thinking of potential product ideas. When you're working on a design, when you're working on a product, you think that every change you make is all towards a singular direction. You're all trying to work towards a singular, result. But in actuality, something that you've done might not work with something that your partner has done. So it'd be interesting to have a technique or a system that identifies what is working in the opposite direction.
Yeah. That's interesting. So some sort of way of visualizing it, or as a team, maybe there's like, I don't know, I'm imagining some sort of display that like shows different elements of the project and which ones are actually, I guess, which are the ice maybe, or which are the shadows, or I don't know. Interesting. Yeah, that sounds, makes sense. They're saying, I mean, the ice one is, the ice remaining in the shadows is a really difficult card to deal with. So it's impressive that you managed to find something with that because, it's such an odd thing. It's just like, but it's, I don't know, it's like the remnant of something that is sort of a hangover of it, but then it disappears, but then it's, I don't know. So it's, it was interesting seeing that used actually, which is good. So has anyone got any, are there any kind of final comments or questions people have about this sort of approach? Because, I mean, I appreciate you've only had like a few minutes to try this out. And this is not particularly, you can see it's not particularly difficult. It's effectively just combining semi-random things and saying, well, does this inspire something? But I would say it can be a way of generating ideas that can then lead in other directions. And one of the most interesting things I think is when people are able to reframe an existing problem. Like you think the problem is this, but maybe some other perspective gives you a different way of framing it. So you draw the boundary differently. You actually will describe the problem in a different way even. And that seems to be one of the ways that this sort of metaphorical approach can help. I mean, it's, the famous academic example is of this is a company that was making, when synthetic paintbrush bristles first became a thing, like actually plastic bristles rather than hair, there was a metaphor of seeing them as pipes or channels rather than almost they were the gaps between them were a way of drawing paint between the bristles rather than it being we're coating the bristles in paint and then transferring it. The shift of that team to thinking, and I'm not sure how they came up with the pipe metaphor, where it came from, but that shift of thinking about the gaps rather than the bristles themselves led to them redesigning the paintbrushes and improved the effectiveness of it. Right, so it was a shift that was a subtle thing that actually led to a different, it's a really boring example, honestly, but that's the canonical academic example of using metaphor reframings in this. So I just wanted to finally, and we've got to finish, but you can see this as a type of, so the idea of apophenia, which is seeing patterns where there aren't any, effectively. So it's often seen as a very negative thing. It's like someone saying, well, you think there's a face in the toast, or you think that pattern of of raindrops is like a picture of something that's meaningful, it's often seen as like a sort of cognitive deficiency or a cognitive bias, or in a bad way, or a kind of a thing to be avoided. But you might see it actually as like a method. Like if you can see patterns where other people don't, or you can see patterns that maybe are not real, but they can nevertheless inspire you to think in a different way, it can give you an edge over people who are not doing that, or who are not thinking in that way. And there's so many, there's some very interesting, it's been done a lot in kind of more artistic applications, but I think this as an approach in generating ideas can be useful. And there's some work on this if you look up terms like disruptive improvisation, which is often about effectively semi-randomly injecting stuff to change the way people do things or to get them to think in different ways. There's some really interesting work on that. So, overall, if it can give you this like expanded conceptual vocabulary, that may be a way of thinking about this. And if you're interested in the cards, you can download them and the worksheets, and also like an instruction booklet that gives you some different exercises, newmetaphors.com. But we're going to be doing print orders for them hopefully later this semester. It's taken a bit of time kind of planning it, but they will be, you can download them and do what you want with them, and give us feedback if you find them useful. But or if you're interested in any of the other stuff we're doing, the Imaginaries Lab, do look at the website, and we've got a newsletter and things you can sign up and see what other events we're doing. But thank you all for your time. Thanks, Sis. Right.